singer John Denver has died. Denver was killed when an experimental plane he was flying crashed in California's Monterey Bay.
They still are putting together the pieces of a mystery.
Something very bad happened.
With nothing but a guitar and a voice that defined a generation,
Blue Ridge Mountain, Shenandoah River.
John Denver became one of America's most beloved folk legends, known for songs like Take Me Home, Country Roads, and Annie's Song. His music stood for peace, nature, and simplicity. But behind that image was a life marked by pressure, personal struggles, and a growing obsession with flying. On October 12, 1997, it all came to a tragic end over Monterey Bay, leaving behind questions that refused to fade. So what really happened in those final moments? And was it truly just an accident? Join us as we uncover the John Denver mystery finally solved, and why it may not be what you think. Early rise and life struggles. Before the fame, the tragedy, and the questions that still surround his final flight, John Denver was born Henry John Deutschendorf, Jr. on December 31, 1943, in Roswell, New Mexico. But thanks to the nature of his father's military career, he hardly stayed in one place for long as a child, constantly moving instead between military bases across the United States and even parts of Asia. Back in the 40s and 50s, military households were built on structure, discipline, and emotional restraint. And for a boy growing up under the roof of a strict Air Force officer, affection often came second to obedience. His father, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Deutschendorf Sr., was respected in the Air Force, but at home, the relationship between father and son remained distant and complicated. Years later, John himself would admit that he spent most of his childhood desperately trying to earn his father's approval, but rarely feeling like he succeeded. And that desperate search for approval would eventually shape John's life in ways nobody could have predicted. While the constant moving made it difficult for him to build lasting friendships, young John found comfort somewhere else, and that was music. At age 11, John Denver's grandmother gave him an acoustic guitar, a simple gesture that unknowingly changed the entire course of his life. Almost immediately, the shy military kid became obsessed with learning songs and writing melodies of his own. Music became more than just a hobby. It became an emotional outlet, a way for him to express feelings he struggled to communicate in everyday life. And as he grew older, that attachment only became stronger. By the early 1960s, John Denver had enrolled at Texas Tech University, but college life quickly felt secondary compared to the dream forming in his mind. Eventually, he made a bold decision that shocked his family at the time. He dropped out of school and drove to Los Angeles to pursue music full-time. At first, success did not come easy. John performed in small clubs and coffee houses while trying to establish himself in the crowded folk music scene of California. During this period, he also made another important decision. Realizing that his surname, Deutschendorf, was difficult for audiences and promoters to remember, he adopted the stage name John Denver, inspired by the capital city of Colorado, a state whose mountains and landscapes deeply resonated with him. The name sounded simpler, warmer, and more approachable, fitting perfectly with the image that would later make him famous across America. And before long, that image began paying off. In the late 1960s, Denver joined the folk group The Mitchell Trio, replacing one of its founding members and gaining valuable exposure in the music industry. But unbeknownst to many at the time, John's ambitions stretched far beyond simply being part of a group. He wanted to become a songwriter whose music connected with ordinary people on a deeply personal level. That breakthrough finally arrived in 1971 with the release of Take Me Home, Country Roads, a song that unexpectedly transformed John Denver into one of the biggest stars in America. Practically overnight, his gentle voice, wholesome appearance, and heartfelt lyrics struck a chord, with audiences still recovering from the turmoil of the Vietnam War and political scandals like Watergate. Unlike many musicians of the era who leaned into rebellion and controversy, Denver represented something softer and more comforting. Songs like Rocky Mountain High, Sunshine on My Shoulders, and Annie's Song turned him into a cultural phenomenon, selling millions of records worldwide and establishing him as America's clean-cut folk ambassador. To the public, John Denver seemed almost untouchable. A smiling outdoorsman who sang about love, nature, and simple living while advocating for environmental causes, world hunger awareness, and even NASA's civilian space program. But behind the scenes, something far more complicated was unfolding. Keep watching to find out what it was. Friends, bandmates, and business associates slowly began noticing that the cheerful public image did not always match the man they encountered privately. Denver had an overwhelming need to be loved and admired. And when that validation disappeared, his moods could shift dramatically. There were moments of warmth and charm, followed by periods of frustration, melancholy, and emotional volatility. As his fame grew throughout the 1970s, the pressure surrounding his personal life also intensified, especially within his marriage to Annie Martell, the woman who inspired his beloved hit, Annie's Song. Though the couple adopted 2 children and appeared picture-perfect to fans, the reality inside their home had become increasingly strained. The endless touring schedules, public attention, and Denver's growing dependence on alcohol slowly created cracks in the relationship that became impossible to ignore. Then, in 1977, those cracks exploded into public view during one particularly heated argument between the couple. According to Denver's own later admissions, his anger spiraled so badly that he took a chainsaw and literally cut their marital bed in half. The bizarre outburst stunned even those closest to him because it revealed a side of John Denver the public could barely imagine. Beneath the calm smile and gentle songs was a man struggling with emotional control, unresolved childhood wounds, and rising substance issues. Though the marriage officially ended in 1982, the instability did not disappear. Denver later remarried Australian actress Cassandra Delaney in 1988. But that relationship also became turbulent and eventually collapsed into divorce by 1993. Around the same time, his drinking problems had escalated enough to attract legal trouble, leading to a driving under the influence arrest in Colorado that badly damaged his wholesome reputation. And unknown to many fans watching from the outside, these incidents were only the beginning of a far darker chapter that would eventually place John Denver on a tragic collision course with himself. Obsession for flying and the investigation that followed. Yet while music had made John Denver famous, there was another obsession quietly taking over his life behind the scenes, and that was aviation. Somewhere in the middle of the 1970s, John Denver discovered flying, and almost immediately, it became far more than a recreational pastime. To him, the cockpit represented escape in its purest form. Up in the air, there were no reporters, no broken relationships, no expectations to maintain the image of America's smiling folk hero. There was only silence, altitude, and control. Friends close to Denver later described flying as one of the few activities that genuinely calmed him during the more chaotic periods of his life. It gave him the same emotional release that songwriting once had before fame complicated everything. And unlike many celebrities who treated private aviation like a luxury accessory, Denver immersed himself deeply into the technical side of it. He studied aircraft systems, accumulated certifications, and steadily built a reputation as a skilled aviator among fellow pilots. Over the years, He logged thousands of hours operating different aircraft, from simple recreational planes to far more demanding experimental models. The deeper he fell into aviation culture, the more fearless he appeared to become. To outsiders, it looked admirable. Here was a musician who approached flying with genuine dedication rather than ego. But beneath that confidence, subtle warning signs had already started emerging. One of the earliest incidents happened in the late 1980s during a landing attempt in Arizona, involving one of Denver's vintage aircraft. Conditions were not ideal, and somewhere during touchdown, things went badly wrong. The airplane veered out of control and overturned on the runway in dramatic fashion. Though Denver escaped without major injuries, the accident left many experienced pilots uneasy. Officially, mechanical complications played a role in the mishap, yet some aviation observers privately questioned whether Denver's own decision-making under pressure may have worsened the situation. It was the kind of close call that normally forces a pilot into caution. But for Denver, surviving the crash seemed to have the opposite effect. Instead of becoming more conservative, he grew increasingly fascinated by technically challenging aircraft and high-performance flying. Around this period, those closest to him began noticing another troubling pattern. John Denver had developed a habit of pushing himself beyond comfortable limits, not only in aviation, but throughout his personal life. His career was no longer dominating the charts the way it once had. His marriages had collapsed, and his public image had already begun showing cracks through alcohol-related incidents and emotional instability. Flying, however, still gave him a sense of mastery. In the cockpit, he was no longer a fading celebrity struggling to hold on to relevance. He was in command. Then came another accident, one far more serious than the first. During the mid-1990s, Denver was involved in a second hard landing while operating an aerobatic aircraft in New Mexico. Witnesses later described the descent as unstable from the beginning. The aircraft clipped obstacles during touchdown and suffered substantial damage. Once again, Denver survived. But unlike the earlier crash, investigators examining this case became increasingly concerned by the sequence of events leading up to the incident. Reports pointed toward procedural mistakes during approach preparations and lapses in standard safety routines. To seasoned aviation professionals, these were not small oversights. They suggested a pilot who may have been relying too heavily on confidence and instinct rather than discipline. And here comes the disturbing part. With all that happened, none of it slowed him down. If anything, Denver's fascination with flight only intensified. He openly spoke about dreams of circumnavigating the globe by air and remained deeply connected to civilian space exploration programs. His admiration for astronauts and experimental engineering bordered on obsession. There was always another aircraft to master, another challenge to conquer, and perhaps most importantly, another opportunity to feel free from the emotional turbulence that increasingly defined his private life. By 1997, Denver had developed an interest in experimental aircraft, eventually purchasing a small Canard-style airplane known as the Long EZ. Unlike conventional airplanes, the Long EZ looked unusual, almost alien to casual observers, with its swept wings, rear-mounted propeller, and highly customized structure. It was lightweight, fast, and efficient, but it also demanded familiarity and precision from the person flying it. This particular aircraft had not been built by Denver himself. It had passed through other hands before reaching him, meaning several of its systems had already been altered from their original configuration. One modification would later become critically important. The fuel selector system inside the aircraft had been repositioned into an awkward location behind the pilot's shoulder. Under normal circumstances, switching fuel tanks in an airplane is supposed to be simple and instinctive, allowing the pilot to keep full attention on flying. But in this aircraft, Accessing the selector required twisting the body into an uncomfortable angle, while simultaneously maintaining control of the plane. Experienced pilots who later reviewed the design criticized the setup heavily, arguing that it introduced unnecessary distraction during flight operations. What made the situation more concerning was how little time Denver had actually spent inside this aircraft before taking it into the air alone. Though enthusiastic about the long EZ, he had only logged a brief amount of experience operating it. Previous owners reportedly advised him to spend more time learning the aircraft's unique fuel system and handling characteristics before attempting regular flights. But confidence had long become one of Denver's defining traits as a pilot. He believed he could adapt quickly. Then came October 12, 1997. That afternoon, John Denver arrived at Monterey Peninsula Airport in California, preparing for what appeared to be a routine solo flight above the coastline. Weather conditions were relatively calm, and nothing initially suggested the day would end in disaster. Witnesses watched as the sleek experimental aircraft lifted smoothly into the sky and headed out over Monterey Bay. For several moments, everything appeared perfectly normal. Then, something changed. People near the shoreline later recalled seeing the aircraft moving strangely at low altitude. According to multiple accounts, the plane suddenly tilted downward in an aggressive descent before crashing violently into the water below. The impact shattered the aircraft almost instantly, scattering debris across the ocean's surface. Rescue teams responded quickly, but there was no possibility of survival. John Denver died on impact at the age of 53. News of the crash stunned the world. Fans mourned the loss of the man whose music had once symbolized comfort, peace, and emotional sincerity for an entire generation. Initial media coverage focused almost entirely on grief and tribute, but behind the scenes, federal investigators were already beginning the difficult task of reconstructing what had happened in the aircraft's final moments. And the deeper the investigation went, the more troubling the picture became. Because the airplane was experimental, investigators faced immediate complications. There was no cockpit recording system, no flight data recorder, and no complete manufacturing standard to rely upon. Wreckage recovery from the ocean also proved extremely difficult. Even so, analysts slowly pieced together evidence from witness statements, aircraft fragments, and technical evaluations. Eventually, investigators reached a conclusion that shifted attention toward the aircraft's unusual fuel system and Denver's actions shortly before the crash. According to the official findings, Denver likely attempted to switch fuel tanks while airborne after one tank began running low. But because the selector valve sat behind him in such an awkward position, he may have twisted his body while trying to reach it, unintentionally applying pressure to the aircraft's controls in the process. At such a dangerously low altitude, even a brief loss of stability would have been catastrophic. Within seconds, the aircraft entered a steep descent from which recovery became impossible. And just like that, the man who spent years chasing freedom in the skies became another tragic figure, claimed by the very passion that once made him feel alive. But that was not the end of the investigation, because the next discovery would raise even more shocking questions. Evidence and more findings from the crash. But even after investigators released their official findings, many people within aviation circles believed the story still contained unanswered questions. Because the deeper experts looked into John Denver's final months, the harder it became to dismiss the tragedy as nothing more than a simple accident. Slowly, a more troubling picture started taking shape, one involving confidence, emotional strain, and a growing pattern of risky decisions. One of the first concerns centered around Denver's actions before takeoff. Airport personnel later described him as calm and friendly, showing no visible signs of intoxication or panic. Yet several witnesses also noted that his inspection of the aircraft appeared unusually brief, considering the type of airplane he was about to fly. The Long EZ was not a beginner-friendly aircraft. It demanded patience, familiarity, and careful preparation, especially for someone still learning its systems. Aviation experts later argued that a cautious pilot would likely have spent far more time reviewing fuel controls and emergency procedures before leaving the runway. More concerning was the fact that John Denver reportedly declined additional guidance regarding the aircraft. According to people familiar with the situation, he had opportunities to receive more detailed instruction about the plane's unique handling characteristics before flying alone. Instead, he chose to proceed solo. To many investigators, this reflected a dangerous confidence that had quietly developed over years of flying. After accumulating thousands of hours in the air, Denver appeared increasingly willing to trust instinct over procedure. Supporters of Denver pushed back against that criticism. They argued that he was an experienced pilot who genuinely understood aviation. And in many ways, they were right. Flying was not a casual hobby to him. He invested enormous amounts of time and energy into it. But veteran instructors have long warned that experience alone does not guarantee discipline. In fact, some pilots become less cautious once they begin feeling untouchable. Then attention shifted toward the aircraft itself. The Long EZ was an experimental airplane, meaning many of its systems could be customized outside normal commercial standards. While experimental aircraft can operate safely for years, they also require extensive familiarity from whoever flies them. Denver's aircraft reportedly contained several modifications, including the awkward placement of the fuel selector behind the pilot's shoulder. Investigators later discovered that not every change made to the airplane had been fully documented when ownership changed hands. That alone raised concerns among aviation analysts. What made matters worse was how little time Denver had actually spent flying the aircraft before taking it up alone. Transitioning into unfamiliar airplanes normally involves gradual training flights, often alongside instructors familiar with the specific model. Denver skipped much of that process. Critics later argued that this reflected the same impulsive tendencies visible elsewhere in his life, a desire to prove capability before fully understanding limitations. Then another troubling detail emerged. At the time of the crash, Denver reportedly did not possess an active medical certification required for legal flight operations. Years earlier, legal troubles involving alcohol had complicated his relationship with aviation authorities. Although toxicology reports found no alcohol in his system after the crash, questions still surfaced about whether emotional pressure and past behavioral patterns may have affected his judgment. And by 1997, there were signs that Denver's personal struggles had intensified. His commercial success no longer matched the heights of the 1970s. Music trends had changed, concert attendance had slowed, and financial pressures reportedly continued building behind closed doors. Friends later described him as emotionally unpredictable during this period, capable of optimism one moment and frustration the next. Those closest to him insisted he still loved flying, but many also admitted he seemed increasingly restless. Then came perhaps the most unsettling discovery of all. As investigators reconstructed the flight, radar evidence suggested Denver may not have been flying conservatively before the crash. Instead of maintaining stable patterns, the aircraft appeared to perform unusual altitude and direction changes inconsistent with a simple familiarization flight. Some aviation experts later speculated that Denver may have been experimenting with more aggressive maneuvering during the flight. That detail became critically important because Denver had departed with a relatively limited fuel supply, divided between separate tanks. More demanding maneuvers would have increased fuel consumption and forced him to switch tanks sooner than expected. Combined with the difficult fuel selector placement, the situation may have created a fatal distraction inside the cockpit within seconds. Investigators also found indications that certain standard safety procedures may not have been fully completed before takeoff. To aviation professionals, these details painted a disturbing pattern, not of one catastrophic mistake, but of multiple smaller decisions gradually leading toward disaster. And that possibility changed the way many people viewed John Denver's final years, because the tragedy no longer appeared to be random misfortune alone. Instead, it looked like the culmination of emotional turbulence, overconfidence, and increasing risk-taking. Flying had once given Denver freedom from pressure and disappointment. But somewhere along the way, that same freedom may also have encouraged him to ignore the limits that once protected him. Even though debates surrounding his final flight continue decades later, none of that erased the impact John Denver left on music and popular culture. His legacy remains far greater than the tragedy that ended his life. So, what do you think? Was this a tragic accident, or was there more going on beneath the surface? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And click on the next video on your screen. You'll enjoy it.